Across the country, all eyes are on ICE. And here in southern Nevada, concerns over the detention, deportation, and mistreatment of immigrants is growing. As ICE activity ramps up in our community, it's important to know what your rights are, both as citizens and non-citizens. So today on CityCast Las Vegas, we're talking with Attar Hasibullah, Executive Director of the ACLU of Nevada, about the practical realities of an encounter with ICE. It's Thursday, January 29th. I'm Sonia Cho Swanson, and here's what Las Vegas is talking about. Attar, what's the famous curse, may you live in interesting times? Is that what you're feeling right now? Because I'm feeling that.
You know, sometimes folks will ask, first, thanks for having me on, but
Sure.
Sometimes folks will ask me, what's it like in your role? And I've had different experiences. Obviously, I've been at this a while, over 5 years leading this organization, and then this work a long time. But for the last year, the easiest way I could describe it is it's like being an extra in somebody else's nightmare. And I say that because the number of situations we've had to encounter this past year, which are atypical, even in a nation and in a state and city that tend to have civil liberties and civil rights issues pretty consistently. This year has been an outlier. This past year has been an outlier. And even in January of 2026, we've seen a dramatic and serious escalation in what's occurring. And so my role and my team's role is to provide support for our community to challenge these systemic practices. And we're doing that all across the country. But it's emotionally taxing for everyone. Namely the people we serve. And so to be an extra in this nightmare, I suppose would be better than not being able to play any role at all. But it's not easy and our community's really suffering.
What do you think Las Vegans are learning from what's happening in Minneapolis right now?
Yeah, look, I think there's a variety of things to be learned from what's happening in Minneapolis, but we're starting to see some of that on the ground. So we've seen both an increase in immigration enforcement activity here, but really what's notable in the last month has been the opposition to the types of actions that ICE has been engaging in. It's a real reminder to our community that, nobody here is going to put up with the stuff that ICE is doing either.
I'm glad you mentioned that because I found it really interesting to see Henderson residents come out in opposition of the city's contract with ICE at their detention center. Well, let's get into some of those practical aspects, no matter which side of the aisle they're on. I mean, if they come into an encounter with ICE, what do you think people in Las Vegas should know about their rights? And let's start with those who are U.S. citizens. What should you do if you, for example, see an ICE agent stopping someone or like ringing their doorbell?
Yeah, like first and foremost, one of the more important things to remember is that the legal landscape that's involved in dealing with federal immigration enforcement officials has changed considerably during the last 2 years, during the last 12 months, and is continuing to change what seems like on an almost monthly basis. If you're talking about an observer or somebody who's like witnessing it, so this is different than an individual who's stopped by ICE, right? Because there's a different set of implications and rights that are involved. The most important thing somebody can do in that instance is to record the incident. And that's something that the government may end up saying that people shouldn't be doing. But you are, in fact, able to record government. You're able to record just about anything in public view at that point. And that becomes a really, really key step. Part of the reason why there's narratives that are existing, mass mobilizations happening all across the country and things of that nature, are because people have their cell phones and they've been recording these incidents and documenting them. The other piece where that becomes really important is that if that individual should find themselves in immigration court or in federal court challenging a specific approach to immigration that was undertaken, that means that there would be direct evidence that could be used to assist that individual as they're combating the claims made by the government, which this past year have become incredibly outlandish. The other piece that's associated is people are able to use their voice from a distance or up close. You are able, in fact, to shout, to scream if you need to. You're able to blow a whistle. There are not prohibitions on that in the way the government would often suggest. What you're unable to do is actually obstruct such an investigation. And normally that comes in the physical context. So physical proximity is the governing element that's associated there versus an individual. And we've seen this in other places. You're seeing people blow whistles, right? There's no prohibition on blowing whistles. And
what does that do?
Well, the example right now that we're seeing in Minnesota, which is quite scary and horrific, there's been videos posted of communities that are terrified about what ICE might do. And I just saw a video last night. You could hear on the audio people screaming, "They're coming, they're coming," and other cut off the lights, turn off the lights, get back inside your house, amplified on sort of like a megaphone, and people blowing their whistles.
So
And
it's an
that's to alert their
alerting
neighbors.
neighbors. Okay, I see. So, I remember seeing a video one time of a man being detained, taken by ICE, and a woman who was filming asked him, "What's the phone number you want me to call?"
Yeah, that has become a more practical tactic that folks have used. Is they'll shout out like, "Who do you want me to call?" Or like, "What's the phone number?" And somebody will quickly write it down and attempt to reach out to the family member to be able to do that. Now, the hard part about that occurring too is we've also, and I will say this firsthand in Vegas, it's helpful to share the information once it's verified from a real source. There is a lot of misinformation that is continuously shared because
Hmm.
people want to be helpful. So they think they're
Yeah.
doing a service by saying, "We just spotted ICE on, Craig and Jones."
Hmm.
And in fact, it's not ICE. It wasn't verified.
How would you verify?
There's a variety of ways. Oftentimes, if somebody ends up, ICE normally doesn't just, for the most part here in Las Vegas, they normally don't just linger around. So oftentimes there will be specific items that they're wearing. Most often that's a flak vest that will say DHS police, immigration police, ICE on the back of it. Not always, but more often than not, they're engaged in that gear. Often they're wearing masks now, and that's what we've seen. Often they're in unmarked vehicles. Those are all factors that help sort of shore up the reality that in fact might be an ICE officer. Saying, though, it's ICE without following up with additional details becomes very challenging. It becomes a capacity drain. And it also creates fear. There
Hmm.
is the ability to do that. And if there's locations, if somebody says, "I heard 3 hours ago ICE was at such and such community center,"
Hmm.
there's the ability for you to go and check too and speak to somebody there and say, "Hey, was this accurate?" and correct the information. It's not on one organization or two that are just doing this, but it requires all of us together to be able to do this to keep
Hmm.
our neighbors safe.
And you mentioned that this is the role of an observer. But I think what I'm also seeing is that the role of an observer is kind of being cast in a new light by this administration, being labeled as domestic terrorist if you simply pull out your phone Alex Preddy was an observer, right? So despite the fact that we might have the legal right to do something, to what degree should we be worried about our safety?
Look, safety is always a concern if you're dealing with an authoritarian government. This is a government that doesn't operate with the rule of law at the forefront. And this is also a government that has attacked nearly every constitutional right that exists, including the Second Amendment. So the president's statements yesterday that effectively said that it sort of limited the from their vantage point, limited the purview of what the Second Amendment looks like. In fact, not in accordance with the law. I'm a constitutionalist and somebody who supports all civil liberties and all civil rights.
Hmm.
That includes the Second Amendment, right? There,
Hmm.
there is criteria that's in place for what that looks like, and certainly the law has been established there. But this is a government that doesn't even establish or doesn't even respect that specific right. So all across the board, there's elements there. There's a disassociation between what people can do and whether it's safe to do so.
This is sort of where I think I struggle a little bit with this idea of, these are your rights in the US under the Constitution. And yet we're seeing, it's all well and good to say that you have these rights, but if those rights no longer protect you, even from death at the hands of a federal agent, then why do they matter?
Well, they matter for a variety of reasons, and I'll explain why. The goal of authoritarianism is to drive out any hope that you might possess. It's to leave you in a state of hopelessness, leave you in a state of despair, feeling that nothing's capable of change, nothing's capable of modification, that the egregious civil rights violations that occur won't be addressed. And in reality, while this administration attempts to do that, they have been met with resistance. That's a key point of this equation. One of the stories that's not going to get illuminated quite often is the fact that we serve as class counsel for immigration bond related issues here in Nevada for individuals who previously were able to seek a bond hearing, but were denied that opportunity based on this administration's change in policy and were forced into immigration detention. After we were named class counsel a couple months ago, for two of our clients that found themselves in ICE custody and in detention, subject to removal proceedings and automatic removal from the United States, We got successful orders. Those two individuals have now been released because of DHS's actions. So every win's not going to end up being highlighted. And
Mm.
part of the responsibility that's associated for that is because this administration continues to escalate its aggression towards communities. And in a finite media cycle, which is what we exist within, it's almost impossible for positive stories or individual stories about very many issues to maintain any level of status or continued sort of sharing or anything else of the sort on a consistent basis. It's impossible.
It's seeding fear in a way, right? This idea that like fear will keep people home.
It's trauma porn is in
Hmm.
fact what it's become.
Let's boil down to some practical tips here because I think you're going to have a lot more answers than, the average Google search on this front. How can you tell if someone is actually an ICE agent or not? Do they have badge numbers? Are they required to share
ICE
a badge
doesn't even,
number?
they don't even show their face.
Let's just say, for example, someone who claiming to be an ICE officer or agent approaches you and says, I'm with ICE, show me your papers.
The law states at that point that, again, the individual should be carrying an identifying feature. But what we are seeing play out, which is why I mentioned in real time, it's difficult to actually provide real time feedback there, is because the United States Supreme Court actually in this past, let's say 6 months ago, greenlighted almost the process of engaging in racial profiling or profiling based on accents. And so ICE, in fact, has been doing that. They have, in fact, been demanding to see individuals' paperwork or asking them where they were born. And when individuals were non-compliant, they detained them, including U.S. citizens. Now, that detention can't last in permanency because the individual is a U.S. citizen. But the reality is people are not even aware that these are ICE officials. That's part of the reason why the challenge becomes so pervasive right now. So somebody could say, no, I'm not complying, and then find themselves in detention. The challenge becomes, how do we actually effectively deal with this as a society? We're seeing other municipalities that are stepping up right now and saying, we will respond if a 911 call comes through, if an ICE officer is at your door, something else like that, and respond with emergency services to ensure that it's actually ICE, to ensure that they're complying with the law.
So is that the next step then? So let's say your neighbor who is not a citizen gets stopped by ICE. ICE says, I want to see your paperwork. Are they legally required to comply?
So this is, again, if they are not identifying themselves, they're operating outside of the boundaries of the law. That's why I mentioned that you're not going to preclude yourself from being detained by ICE because you talk to ICE nicely. I think sometimes people think that, these are the tips I'll do, then I won't get detained. There's a difference between being detained and being charged with a crime and being convicted of a crime.
Okay.
Legally, an individual, just the same example, legally an individual does not have to, and I would never recommend an individual let an ICE officer or individual into their house without a judicial warrant.
So this is something that you can't legally, you can say, you cannot come into my house without a warrant. It doesn't matter whether you're a citizen, a non-citizen. If they come to your door and you answer the door,
there's
they need
a
a
difference. They need a judicial warrant. A judicial warrant is different than an ICE warrant. ICE carries something called ICE warrants, which is probably, like, from a basic perspective, a lot of folks are not going to be aware of. It's why we do the Know Your Rights trainings.
Is this like Monopoly money? Is it sort of like when a kid tries to pay you for something with Monopoly money and you're like, oh, sure, that's cute?
At least Monopoly money gives the appearance that you might be able to buy something artificially with it. In this instance, it's even worse than that. An ICE warrant, which is what ICE normally uses, or an immigration warrant, is signed off by what's viewed as an immigration official. That's an individual that works for DHS. It's an internal warrant. It historically has not allowed for ICE to enter into someone's house. In order to enter into somebody's house, historically, you'd need a judicial warrant signed by a judge. Oftentimes, it's going to be a federal district court judge or a magistrate judge, and it'll have specific parameters associated with the ability to enter into one's residence. It's also the same way if there's a private area that's located within a business, or something at a school or healthcare center that's behind in a private area that's not open to the public. Historically, they've needed a judicial warrant. I mentioned the immigration warrant because they are now relying on that, ICE, to suggest that they're able to engage in these types of Fourth Amendment violations, which they are not. but that's an area that's going to end up being litigated. And the reason why I mention
Interesting.
that is because that internal memo just dropped a week ago, right? It's as if you said this constitutional right no longer exists because we created a memo that said it doesn't exist. Well, that
Interesting.
memo, once it's challenged, will end up being a core component of what that ends up looking like moving forward in terms of how
Okay.
we assess the Fourth Amendment.
So, under our current understanding of the Fourth Amendment, if you have a home, a small business, like a private area
A private area within the small business, not a
within,
full small business.
I see, a private, so like a back office, a storeroom.
A back office, and the rule for a back office or any of
Yeah.
those private areas is there would be a written policy that says it's a private area, not open to the public. And there
Okay.
would be signage that specifies it's a private area. But yes, a private
Put up
area
a
in that
sign
instance.
that says this is a private area for staff only, not for the public. And then that area ICE cannot enter that area without a judicial warrant. That is a warrant signed by a judge. It is not the Monopoly money version of a warrant. Gotcha.
That is
Okay.
right. And you're able to actually view images associated with that in our full trainings on our website at
Okay.
aclunv.org. We actually
Okay.
have those materials laid out for Immigration Know Your Rights. They're in
Yeah.
English and Spanish, Tagalog, and other languages. And the reason why we did that is because those examples become permanent. You're welcome to also share that information if you're a listener
Yeah.
right now with
Great.
others. The only thing we ask people that are doing that to do is list the date that you're sharing that from and credit the source, which is ACLU of Nevada. Not because we want additional credit, but because if there's any scrutiny that comes towards the consideration of what those materials suggest, I'd rather we bore the weight of that scrutiny than the average person who's listening in and trying to protect their neighbor.
So you mentioned private spaces of small businesses, private homes. What about if you're just like in a public area, a park, a street, I don't know, a church, a school?
A church, in fact, also can have private areas, and churches and
Fair.
schools have been different. Same thing with schools. Once you enter into the point behind the area where the general public's allowed, which is normally the front office, nobody's allowed in the back. So think about it in
Yeah.
that context. But let's talk about the street encounters because that's actually one
Yeah.
where there's relevance there. And what we've seen is individuals on the street being stopped by ICE and detained therefrom. So ICE does have the ability in public locations to engage in targeted immigration enforcement.
Like a Home Depot. They'll show up at a Home Depot, for example.
Correct. The issue is that there's a difference between targeted enforcement, and oftentimes the way targeted enforcement happens is they'll have a packet of information related to an individual with a photo of the individual. That's why we call it targeted enforcement. The individual's name specified, there's a basis for it. It lists their immigration history. There's the ability to actually utilize that photo to recognize who the person is to stop them. Now, there's issues with that in many instances, but that's also distinct from what they've been doing in places like Minnesota, which is stopping random people based on their appearance and asking them additional questions. It's why we suggest that folks are able to invoke their right to remain silent. They may end up detained in that instance, but again, when we see ICE engaging in these types of conduct, it's almost as if you see somebody with a gun kidnapping somebody else. It's the reason why we call kidnapping, because they're in fact engaged in these grabbings of people off the street for nothing more than their appearance.
So, I'm thinking about a story because a lot of what you're talking about is that some of these detentions or arrests kind of happen sort of out of the blue. It's very surprising to a lot of people. And one example that comes to mind was in December, a Las Vegas mother with her family was getting off a plane in Hawaii, and there were ICE agents waiting for her at the airport, and they just took her in front of her entire family. So I'm wondering, let's say that there's a non-citizen taken into custody, that someone is in your family. What's the first thing you do? How do you keep track of your family member?
Well, look, there's a variety of ways to do this. Now we're getting in practical pieces, which I think are like useful.
Yeah.
So, right.
What's
So
the
we're
very
veering
first
outside
thing?
of we're veering
Yeah.
outside of legal advice, which I appreciate because we tend not to give that. We'll share legal information, but not legal advice that way.
Sure,
We always
sure.
recommend somebody. So there's a few different ways for people to protect themselves, and this is kind of key to that equation. First, there's the ability to share locations, and that becomes really critical in a lot of these steps, right? Like if you don't have a contact point, your location's not shared with anyone, there's some level of risk involved. My location is in fact shared, for instance. I'm a US citizen, but obviously probably if you were to profile me or ICE was to profile me, they may not think that, right? Because of my beautiful brown skin and my beard, right? So they may end up viewing that as a basis for detention. As a result of that, location's shared. So there's always the ability to potentially track in that instance where
When you
somebody
say
might be.
location is shared, what do you mean?
For my
Like,
phone. My phone location is shared.
with people in your family so that people can always keep
Yep.
track of you.
I have at
Oh,
least
wow.
one emergency contact at one time that'll always have my phone location on. And here's the thing. Some people are worried about tracking. your phone's already being tracked, right? That's
Yeah.
especially if you have an iPhone, right? Your Find My
Yeah.
iPhone is on. It's not as if it's going to shut off because there's the ability to almost geolocate at any
So
point.
when you're taken into detention, they don't take your phone from you. You get to keep your phone?
No, they will, but there will be a sign that your phone has been taken away, right? And your location is going to ping at a separate location. It's not going to show at the original point. And at that point, it might be a sign that somebody has found themselves in detention. The other thing that becomes critical is if somebody is at risk, if we're talking about people who are either pending status or they don't have status and they're undocumented, there is, in those specific instances, if that does exist, we always recommend that people exercise maximum preparedness, which means that they should be consulting with an attorney now. And that attorney should have access to their information, should be made aware of any travel plans that are coming up, because that preparation means that in the event you find yourself in detention, you already have an attorney that's prepared to be able to handle your situation. Now, for a variety of reasons, whether that's money or fear, a lot of people will not consult with an attorney in advance of an emergency occurring. That's not the best approach. The best approach is always to consult with an attorney in advance to try to get everything in order, whether that means a power of attorney form for your children and for your assets, which again, it's also, even if you find yourself in ICE custody, it's not as if your assets are instantly seized and things of that nature. You're still able to maintain assets in that way as well. But having an attorney on the front end review that reduces any level of risk associated. The other thing is if there are tiers and categories of individuals who will find themselves more likely to be detained by ICE, that doesn't mean it'll be the only way. But if somebody does have a criminal legal system touch point in the past, whether that's an arrest or a conviction, they may find themselves at an
or even
elevated
something as
risk.
simple as a traffic ticket, right? I mean, we are seeing that's a heightened risk.
You may
now.
find yourself at a heightened risk, but that doesn't mean it's the highest risk. It also doesn't mean it's the lowest risk. And so there's helpful ways to mitigate against those portions. Those check-ins matter though. And when I say share phone locations, and that's for a practical reason. It's the same way check-in calls before and after someone arrives at an airport, once they clear customs, once they're outside of the airport, that matters. There's no centralized system in a lot of these instances where ICE is providing real-time information. The other piece, the reason why we suggest connecting with an attorney is for people who, for instance, there's a visa overstay and they have an alien registration number, an A number. If a family member maintains that A number, they'll be able to utilize your name and your A number to look up your location through ICE's locator feature. If you do not have the A number, the alien registration number, you will not be able to do that. So that's why it's important to make sure that whether, again, it's a trusted, very trusted family member or a lawyer, they have access to be able to track you.
Any last words of advice you have for people who might be encountering ICE in the coming weeks?
3 points of advice here. First, visit our website at aclunv.org and go to the Know Your Rights page if you're confused about anything and assess what that looks like. We don't actually just do it for immigration rights. We do it for First Amendment rights. We do it if you're dealing with ordinary police. We do it in education settings. So that list of Know Your Rights materials is comprehensive. Again, you're able to take that, print it, do what you want with it. It's an important one. Second, if you are in need of a Know Your Rights training and you run a civic organization or nonprofit here in our community, you're able to request a Know Your Rights training from our organization or from a partner organization that will speak to your organization directly and provide that Know Your Rights training. And that could come in a variety of contexts. We don't do the same trainings for healthcare workers that are in healthcare settings as we would for teachers, because those trainings are different and different for churches as well, right? And I say that specifically on the church front because I think I've probably spoken more at Sunday services this past year than maybe any Muslim in the history of the world. Like I'm a fixture there, right? But we do those trainings all the time, and we don't charge for those trainings. Those trainings are free. Third, and this also is important, there is a form that's listed on that same page. Anytime there's a violation of someone's rights from immigration enforcement officials, whether that means that individual is a U.S. citizen and they were profiled and properly detained, or if this was somebody who was in fact undocumented and they found themselves subject civil rights violations by ICE and other officials there, they're able to complete that form. We'll be in touch with them to try to get to the bottom of things. We do that because the escalation in ICE's activity has been well defined, but it's not just ICE that's doing it. And this is something that people miss. This past year, the ICE worked in conjunction with other government agencies, the FBI, the Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms Bureau. They worked with DEA, the U.S. Marshals and Customs and Border Patrol to engage in cooperative immigration enforcement. So this is a cooperative program that they have. That becomes important because someone may think, oh, it's just the U.S. Marshals. Oh, it's just the FBI. They're also engaged in enforcement right now. That's part of the HSI task force that has been involved during the pendency of the last year. The final piece I would give too, there's always a way to get involved and protect your neighbors. Everybody does not have to do every same function. Sometimes that means volunteering for organizations that are supporting students in school because students are dealing with trauma. Sometimes that means offering to be a volunteer for security at a church that might have some undocumented folks there who are simply going to get religious services and faith services, but are nervous about what that might look like. Sometimes that means volunteering for organizations like the ACLU, where you might do a Know Your Rights training for a community group or help lead a Know Your Rights canvas so you can hang up a poster in a small business that describes what employees should be doing in their back break room, which we've done over 500 times in the past year. But there's always ways to get involved. So people need to do their part. It's not enough to get online and be pessimistic or just have discourse. Start to move the needle because it requires all of us to protect our neighbors.
Well, Tara, thank you so much for coming on our show and sharing this really valuable information.
It's my pleasure. Thanks for having me on. And I'm sure there'll be updates every time I'm on. Again, we revert back 10 years. And so I feel like I'm in the 1940s now. And hopefully next time around, we're not in the 1920s, but we'll see where we land. I appreciate the time.
All right, and that's all for today here on CityCast Las Vegas. If you enjoyed the show, if you learned something new, please go tell a friend, share this episode, rate the show, leave us a review, and subscribe to our morning newsletter. Don't forget you can support this show and get some great perks by becoming a CityCast Las Vegas neighbor at membership.citycast.fm. We'll be back tomorrow morning with more news from around the city. Take care.